How much is luxury worth? Timepieces such as Rolex and Tag Heuer sell for thousands and many tens of thousands. While their craftsmanship is impressive, these watches tell time with less precision than your modern smartwatch, which can be easily obtained for a few $100s. I pose a similar question in regards to headphones. How much is a luxury headphone worth to you? If you ask the likes of Focal, they believe that you should pay well over $500 at the least. Today, we're going to take a unique chance to review a product that originally sold for $900 but can now be had for 40% the original cost. And this is the Focal Elegia. Now that Focal has a few new headphones, the Elegia is discontinued and retailers would like you to buy it for around $400. A subscriber kindly let me borrow his brand new Elegia for review. Let's find out if this deeply discounted price is a no-brain grab or a cautious endeavor. Focal makes some bold claims about the Elegia. This is their first closed-back hi-fi audiophile headphone, so that's not entirely surprising. They say that the Elegia will allow you to enjoy an incredible listening experience in total privacy, without worrying about a noisy environment disturbing the moments of pleasure. They say that the Elegia uses, at that time, Focal's newest generation of M-shaped drivers. Focal promises, quote, exceptional dynamics and the most precise sound reproduction. They claim that this headphone will provide, quote, the naturalness and realism of the sound. Typical with hi-fi companies, Focal does not provide any details about the sound signature. Their claim that the Elegia will render, quote, precise sound gives the impression that this headphone is supposed to be neutral, but they do not expressly promise this on their website. Focal also says that you need to burn in the drivers. Vague as always, they say that the Elegia needs to be run for several hours, or if you want to speed up the process, you should play very bassy music through them for at least 24 hours at a relatively high volume. They say that this will stabilize the speaker drivers and allow you to get the very best out of your headphones. Without getting too deep into audiophile mythicism, I will simply suggest that you read articles about burn-in. The Sound Guys and Ratings.com have measurements and a reasoned analysis on the subject of headphone driver burn-in. Frankly, I don't believe that this thing actually exists, and it's more about subjective impression. Anyway, while the Focal website is light on specifics, an interview with a Focal representative on Headfi TV on YouTube offers some helpful information. For example, the Elegia is Focal's attempt to bottle the clear. Well, in general principle. The fact is that the Elegia's internal components are, except for one or two aspects, quite different from that of the clear. And, as the rep says in this interview, the Elegia is not simply the clear with a closed-back design, which is something Sennheiser was criticized for when they released the HD820. Focal claims that the Elegia is intended specifically for studio use. They believe that while open-back headphones present a more natural sound, that is not suitable for recording artists. In fact, so dedicated was Focal with sound isolation that they opted for solid ear pads and not perforated. If you have a chance to watch this interview, I think it will provide some interesting information. Overall, Focal's website could be much clearer about what to expect, but at least we are not given overly exaggerant promises. The Elegia looks like a Focal headphone. This company has a design philosophy that transitions into all of their upper-tier headphones. The Elegia is made mostly of metal. The headband and yoke structure is one piece. The ear cups have a spring mechanism that snaps them into their rest position, and also helps maintain a secure fit. The ear cups do not have horizontal adjustment, but there is some wiggle in the headband. The headband has regular foam padding that is covered with leather. The ear pads are memory foam with a microfiber cover. The ear pads are replaceable, though they are also proprietary. Depending on manufacturer date, your Elegia might come with either a cloth-covered, black and white striped cable or a rubber-covered cable. Here, the Elegia I was sent came with the latter. This cable is about 4 feet long and transmits a significant amount of microphonics when rubbed against a surface. You do not get spare ear pads or a longer cable, though you do receive a nice form-fitting hardshell case. For nearly $1,000, Focal really cheaped out on accessories, which is unfortunately the common ground for audiophile companies. If you ended up paying $900 for this headphone, then you may have been slightly disappointed to not get at least spare ear pads or at least a slightly longer cable that you could use with your hi-fi system. Focal promises that the Elegia will provide, quote, total privacy because of its closed-back design, and obviously this is an exaggeration. The Elegia does a respectable job in external noise isolation. You will easily notice a decrease in ambient sounds with these on, but you will also hear fingers snapping a few feet away, and you can carry a conversation while wearing the Elegia. In fact, I can still hear the clicking noises on my mechanical keyboard with pale white switches. So yes, I think that the sound isolation is good, but nowhere the total privacy that Focal's marketing promises. If you look closely at the Focal emblem on the ear cups, you will notice there's a grill underneath. So while the Elegia is a closed-back headphone, Focal managed to sneak some airflow into the design. As for comfort, of course, this is quite subjective, but I found that the Elegia has a fairly tight clamp. It is noticeably tighter than the clamp for the HD6XX, but less than a Beats headphone. The ear pads mitigate any immediate discomfort around the ears. However, the headband could be better padded, and over about 15 minutes, I could feel pressure at the top of my head, which persisted thereafter. I could wear the Elegia for about 2.5 hours before needing a break, principally because of the headband. Overall, the Elegia is well built. If you are sensitive to tight clamps, then the Elegia might be problematic. This headphone has quite good external noise isolation. To test the Elegia, I paired it with my Burson 3XR, Brooklyn DAC Plus, EcoZerta ITM03, Low2 Paw S1, and the Matrix Mini Eye Pro 3. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Elegia is pretty easy to drive. A simple dongle DAC like the Zerta has plenty of power to get its drivers to perform at peak. Adding a mind-bogglingly powerful amp is just showing off. My impression is that the Elegia has a rolled-off bass response, and one which might sound, for the lack of better words, a bit distant. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The Elegia presented this detail, but the rumble was distant and quite fast. The Allo S4X, in comparison, made this element louder, more present with longer reverberation. When the crescendo hit, the Elegia kept the organ separated from the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, but not nearly as much as on the S4X. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The Elegia presented the sound and all of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Elegia rendered them all similarly. Each drum strike was clear, precise, and barely interacted with subsequent ones. There was no sharp thwacking to them, but more of a thudding sound. Some of these drums sounded closer than others, which is the type of detail that is rarely clear among headphones and IEMs. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, Yupatek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Elegia presented the sub-bass, but it frankly sounded distant. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a large room. In comparison, the S4X presented the sub-bass rumble closer to the ears, louder and with longer reverberation. On the Elegia, the vocals were about 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were slightly louder than the sub-bass on the Elegia. I listened to my Sicaria playlist. I used these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, it seems that the Elegia does not have a strong bass response. Sub-bass appears distant, fast, and retains noticeable separation from mid-bass. If you like more present bass, then a few decibels of EQ might be in order. The mids seem to be close to neutral and clear with a hint of sibilance. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there's natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The Elegia presented both details. The sibilance was slightly emphasized, similar to what the Allo S4X does. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments, and always clear among all the elements, even when the drums played. The drums at times were louder than the other instruments, but not in a way to drown them out. In Want You Back by Haim, the Elegia again showed that it does marginally emphasize vocal sibilance. This was again similar to what the S4X does. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Elegia rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The Elegia initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. However, when the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano interacted with each other, but I could still hear the clapping and snapping of fingers throughout the track. The vocals remained 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Elegia presented the ukulele, drums, and bass all clear and separate. The primary male vocalist was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was not emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The Elegia just barely rendered that second voice layered beneath the primary. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Elegia presented this detail. Overall, the Elegia seems to have a fairly neutral mids response. Elements are generally clear and separate, and vocals always stood out in the track. The treble seems mostly neutral, but does appear to have a slight emphasis in the low to mid treble region. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Elegia presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible, but a bit short of being sharp sounding. The higher pitch notes seemed a bit emphasized, a little bit louder than what I heard on the more neutral Aventone planar. The yellow S4X also did not have quite the treble emphasis of the Elegia. The timpani was marginally underemphasized on the Elegia, and it was more obvious on the S4X. The Elegia has width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the Elegia made the piano sound like it was about 6 feet away. Its bassy notes seemed slightly underemphasized, with less reverberation than what I heard on the LOS4X. The cello was as loud as the piano and sounded, for a lack of better terminology, smooth. Both instruments melded their tonalities slightly. While the notes of both instruments overlapped, it was not difficult to concentrate on one or the other. I quite easily heard the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects, the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 of the De Brubeck Quartet, the Elegia rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments remained clear and distinct. The saxophone was the loudest instrument in the mix, with the cymbals taking second place. The saxophone's higher pitched notes were a bit sharper on the Elegia than on the Aventone planar, but sounded somewhat similar to the S4X. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities, and the Elegia presented all these variations. Overall, the treble seems somewhat neutral, with an emphasis in the low to mid treble region. That emphasis was never harsh or piercing, even at high volumes. While Focal doesn't expressly say that the Elegia is a detail-oriented headphone, any comparison to the Focal Clear probably delves into this question. Is the Elegia a detail monster? No, not if you have a spectrum of detail-oriented headphones. The interesting thing about the Elegia, in my experience, is that while it never shoved details into my ears, there were obvious occasions when I heard more clarity, which helped me pick up details that otherwise would be muffled or would require more concentration to hear on a lot of other audiophile headphones. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear. Even some layered details can be heard, hence the vocals in superposition and the varying cymbal strikes in Take 5. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps. The Focal Clear presents 18. The Austrian Audio Hi-X 65 presents 16 to 17. The Austrian Audio Hi-X 55 presents 16. The Austrian Audio Hi-X 15 and X25BT present 13 to 14. The Hi-Fi Matsundara, Aventone Planar, Sifka Phoenix, and Bear Dynamic DT1990 each present 10 to 11. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sifka Robin, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i each provide 8 to 9. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8. The older M1060C provides 7. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6. And the Elegia, rendered 10 to 11 footsteps. On my scale of detail retrieval, the HD6XX and LCD1 are the average performers. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. So the NDH20 would be considered as below average, and the hifi Mansundara as above average. Here, based on this scale, I think the Elegia has above average detail retrieval. With close-back headphones, you might expect narrow soundstage. This is particularly the impression if a company makes a concerted effort to isolate the listener. However, there is a spectrum of soundstage. Close-back headphones do not all have the same kind of soundstage. For example, the Austrian audio gear has wider soundstage than typical close-back alternatives, and wider than some much-loved open-back designs as well. Here, the Elegia does not present wide soundstage, at least not in the typical sense. If you come from Beats or Bose headphones, then yes, you could say that the Elegia is wide-sounding. But compared to other audiophile headphones, the experience is different. I have a soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The NDH20 and ATH M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average soundstage. The Sivka Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrastrome Pro 1480i have an average to maybe above average soundstage, depending on the particular recording. The hifi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi X55 and X65, and the LCD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The hifi Mandiva has wide soundstage. The HD800S has super wide soundstage. In my opinion, the Elegia has soundstage that is wider than the LCD1 and the HD6XX, but not nearly as wide as the hifi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, or the Austrian Audio Hi X55. Alright, so after all of that, what are we looking at? The Elegia is an interesting sound signature. I can imagine some people would prefer more bass from this headphone. If you expect your close-back headphones to rumble, then the Elegia is not it. Sub-bass compared to the S4X sounds a bit rolled off. There's obvious separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. Transience is fairly quick, though not to the level of typical planar headphones. The mids seem close to neutral. Vocals always stand clear and apart from mid-centric elements. The Elegia does tend to marginally emphasize vocal sibilance, similar to what the S4X does. However, this is nowhere near the harsh emphasis that the HD560S renders. The treble is, I think, fairly neutral, with what sounded like a slight emphasis in the low to mid treble. That emphasis never became harsh or piercing, or uncomfortable for me. I suppose that if you're sensitive to treble, the Elegia probably wouldn't be offensive. On the other hand, if you prefer sharper treble, you might find the performance a bit dull. The Elegia has above average detail and slightly above average soundstage. Going through all my tracks and spending a few weeks with the Elegia, I figure I can understand why some might say that the Elegia out of the box sounds flat. You have to give yourself time to acclimate to the sound signature, though that's no guarantee you'll like what you hear. I experimented a little bit with EQ. Using EQ Mac, I tried to emphasize bass. Pushing beyond reason, I even tried adding up to 15 decibels. On the positive side, I could not get the Elegia to distort. And this headphone does seem to take well to EQ. We have lots of good options in the market, and it is helpful to do comparisons so that we have a better idea of where to spend our money. To that end, we are going to compare several headphones to the Elegia. I selected the Focal Clear, the Shure SRH1540, and the audeze LCD2 Closed as the competitors. For each test, I plugged the headphones into a passive AB switch that was connected to my RME ADI2 DAC. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match. The Clear and Elegia have similar sub-bass presentation. However, the Elegia does render slightly longer reverberation. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is more obvious on the Clear. Mid-bass impact is harder on the Elegia. The mids are also similar. Vocals stand apart from instruments on both headphones, but slightly more on the Clear. The Elegia presents vocals closer to the ears. The Clear accentuates sibilance a bit more than the Elegia. Mid-centric separation of instruments and overall clarity is more obvious on the Clear. The Elegia and Clear are, once again, similar in treble. The Clear presents marginally more energy in the mid-treble, but the upper treble more closely resembles that of the Elegia. The Elegia presents treble instruments closer to the ears, and clarity and separation is more obvious on the Clear. The Clear has noticeably wider soundstage and greater detail retrieval. The 1540 has a noticeably different bass response than the Elegia. The 1540 has more sub-bass and mid-bass emphasis. Transience is a bit longer on the 1540. Separation and clarity between sub-bass and mid-bass is more apparent on the Elegia. Bass impact was harder on the 1540. The mids are also a little different. The 1540 presents vocals more intimately, a little closer to the ears. However, the Elegia emphasizes sibilance while the 1540 does not. Vocals stand clearer, more separated from instruments on the Elegia. Drums can sometimes overpower other elements in a mix on the 1540. The treble is different. The 1540 renders a closer to neutral sound. The Elegia has a marginal emphasis in the lower or mid treble. Clarity in this region is more obvious on the Elegia. The Elegia has a bit wider soundstage than the 1540, and it also renders marginally greater detail than the 1540. The Elegia is usually clearer than the 1540. The LCD2 closed has a slightly different bass response compared to the Elegia. The LCD2 has noticeably faster transients, but a similar amount of sub-bass emphasis. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is more apparent on the Elegia. Bass impact is similar between the two, and neither sounded like it rendered harder hitting drums when volume matched. The mids are a bit different. The Elegia and LCD2 present vocals ahead of instruments, but the Elesia's vocals are closer to the ears. The LCD2 emphasizes sibilance more than the Elegia and also accentuates vocal grain. Clarity in this region is similar, but the LCD2 tends to separate elements a little bit more obviously. The treble is different. The LCD2 has more treble energy, particularly in the mid and upper treble area. Treble instruments sound a bit sharper sometimes on the LCD2. Clarity in this region is a little bit more apparent on the LCD2. The LCD2 has wider soundstage, but the Elegia overall renders greater detail. Hopefully, these kinds of comparisons help formulate a better idea of the differences you might hear among headphones. Sometimes elements sound very similar, and other times there are huge differences. Maybe you would like one of these sound signatures, or perhaps you'll find something completely different that makes you happy. What is luxury, and is it worth whatever it costs? Audeze, Focal, CMF, meze, these are just a few examples of companies that want to be thought of as providers of luxury experiences. You may or may not agree. If price is the determining factor for when we reach luxury, then the Elegia smashes that concept. I mean, yeah, at nearly $1,000, many people would consider that a luxury price. But now, at $400 or less, is it any less luxury at this heavily discounted price? Using price as a measuring stick for quality of components or sound, I think is a fallacy. Instead, you have to think about the entire package. Here, Focal originally said that the Elegia is the close-back version of the Clear. Is it? Well, yes and no. In my experience, the Elegia and Clear do tend to have similar sound signatures. There are differences, but they're not night and day. For example, despite being close-back, the Elesia's bass response is not multiple factors stronger than that of the Clear. But the Clear is also still quite different. Even though the sound signatures may be similar to the Elegia, the Clear has noticeably wider soundstage, more clarity, and more detail, which are aspects of performance. While both headphones are resolving, it's pretty obvious that the Clear is the more analytical of the two. What Focal did here with the Elegia is interesting. I can understand if some people think that the Elesia's bass is insufficient or that it sounds a bit boring. Luckily, studio's application of EQ might solve that concern. There are examples of EQ for the Elegia that can be found online if you want a starting point. The Elegia is quite well built, comes with acceptable accessories and a fairly unique sound signature. At nearly $1,000, I would say that this is not value, especially when Focal cheaps out on the accessories. But at $400 or less, yeah, I think you would be hard-pressed to say that the Elegia should be ignored. In my opinion, this $400 price tag gets you what was not too long ago considered a luxury headphone, without sacrificing anything from the sound. If you think that the Elegia sound signature might be to your liking, then I do think it's a good option to consider.